The laughter from the DMV still clung to her thoughts as the base gates locked behind her, sealing her inside a place most civilians never glimpsed. A few minutes earlier, she had stood in a dull government lobby where people scoffed at her quiet request, unaware of the weight she carried from a past they would never believe. Here, the moment the guards spotted her, the mood shifted sharply. Their casual movements froze, their voices died, and a ripple of tension swept through the courtyard like a warning stirred awake. Boots slammed to the ground in perfect rhythm as if greeting a figure carved into their history. She kept walking, steady and calm, while silent questions filled the air around her. What if the story everyone thought they knew was only half the truth, and the rest had been hidden because the world wasn't ready for it? The hallway seemed to stretch farther than she remembered, though nothing about its strict lines or cold concrete had changed. What had changed was the mix of awe and fear that followed her like a shadow. Each step carried echoes of a time she had sworn never to return to, a time when decisions were made in secret rooms lit by humming screens and whispered orders. She knew crossing this threshold would unravel years of silence, exposing a truth the world had quietly filed away. Yet she felt no hesitation, only a calm certainty that the past was no longer willing to stay buried. The soldiers didn't know why she was here, but they sensed something was coming, something heavy enough to shake the place they believed was unbreakable. The deeper she moved into the base, the stronger the memories pressed against her, as if the walls themselves whispered pieces of the past. She remembered long nights spent studying coded transmissions, rushing between rooms as crises unfolded faster than anyone could breathe. Those days had forged her reputation, though most of the world never learned her name. Now the same people who once issued orders to her stood still as statues, unsure whether to speak or simply salute. She could sense their unease. Something buried in the classified vaults was calling her back, a loose thread in history that only she could untangle. She had come not for recognition, but because silence had finally become more dangerous than truth. The command center came into view, once her domain, now a place where unfamiliar faces moved with sharp precision. Conversations paused the moment she stepped inside, as though an invisible signal ordered the entire room to hold its breath. She scanned the glowing screens, the hum of active systems setting off memories she had tried to box away. The weight of her return settled over the room, thick with the tension of a story, half remembered and mostly hidden. She wasn't here to reclaim authority. She was here because something she once solved had resurfaced, demanding her attention like an old warning she could no longer ignore. At the center of the room lay a sealed folder, thicker than any standard file and marked with symbols she hadn't seen in years. Her pulse steadied as she picked it up, feeling the familiar weight of decisions that could alter far more than this base. The officers watched silently, unsure what kind of storm they were witnessing. She understood their fear. This file represented a breach in the calm they depended on. As she opened it, pages filled with old diagrams and forgotten warnings stared back at her. The past had finally caught up, and she knew the quiet days were over. What waited in these documents was the reason soldiers who didn't know her name still bowed their heads when she passed. The pages in the folder felt heavier with each line she reread, as if the past had pressed its weight into the paper itself. The room around her seemed to drift away, leaving only the cold truth staring back at her. She remembered the night these warnings were first written, the fear that something powerful had slipped beyond control, and the desperate effort to seal it before it spread. Now the same patterns were returning, echoing the same danger she once hoped would never resurface. She closed the folder slowly, letting the silence settle over the watching officers. They wanted answers, but she knew giving them too soon would only provoke panic. This base, built on routine and confidence, was about to face a threat it had forgotten existed, and she was the only one who knew where the fracture had begun. A low hum vibrated through the floor as she stepped toward the restricted archive wing, a place sealed for so long that younger personnel barely knew it existed. The thick air carried the scent of dust and metal, unchanged since the last moment she had walked through it, She could feel memories tugging at her, long meetings, tense alerts, and choices that never left her conscience. Behind her, hesitant footsteps followed, the officers unsure whether they were meant to protect her or seek protection from her. She reached the old biometric door, running her fingers along the cold panel, remembering how many secrets had been locked behind it. Now, the very threat they once buried was clawing back into the present. And whether the others understood it or not, reopening this wing meant crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. The door slid open with a shuddering groan, revealing rows of dimly lit cabinets stretching deep into the archive. She stepped inside without hesitation, letting the cold air wash over her like a memory she had been bracing for. Each cabinet represented a moment in history that never reached the public, events softened in official reports or erased entirely. She moved with purpose, her fingers brushing the labeled drawers until she reached the one she feared would be unlocked once more. Behind her, the officers whispered quietly, unsure if they were witnessing the revival of something long dead or the start of something much worse. She opened the drawer, finding the sealed case that once demanded every waking moment of her life. The danger inside it hadn't faded. It had been waiting. Back in the open light of the archive hallway, she set the sealed case on a steel table, feeling dozens of eyes fix on it. The officers formed a loose circle, each sensing they were standing at the edge of something that would reshape everything they thought they understood. She remembered the original briefing, the warnings about unpredictable behavior, the rush to contain it when control began slipping through their hands. Even then, no one had fully believed the threat could grow as quickly as it did. Now the patterns were repeating, and the evidence in this case would leave no room for doubt. She slid the latches open and lifted the lid, revealing documents that carried the weight of buried truths and the shadow of a danger that never died. The documents inside revealed a pattern of breaches, communications intercepted from an unknown source, encrypted with a signature she recognized instantly. It was the same pattern she had helped shut down years ago, the same one that nearly slipped past every defense they had. She felt the air tighten as she traced the symbols, knowing what they meant long before she spoke. The officers around her didn't breathe, waiting for a verdict they sensed would change their mission entirely. She finally looked up, her voice steady but heavy with the truth they were about to inherit. The threat wasn't just returning. It had already made its move. And whether they understood the full danger or not, the path ahead had already been set in motion. A heavy silence filled the operations room as the meaning behind the encrypted symbols settled into place. She could feel the officers around her waiting for some reassurance, but she knew there was none to give. The source behind those messages had been dormant for years, sealed away after near disaster. Yet now, it was resurfacing with precision and intent. Memories of long nights spent fighting its spread washed over her, reminding her of the moment she realized they weren't just facing a breach. They were facing something capable of outmaneuvering even their most trusted safeguards. She steadied herself, knowing that revealing the next steps would ignite alarm. But hesitation would cost far more. Whatever was sending those signals had already crossed a boundary they once believed unbreakable. As she traced the movement patterns on the screen, she noticed a detail the others missed, an anomaly too deliberate to be random. It mirrored the signature of an operation she had once helped shut down, an operation that pushed the limits of what their systems could contain. The officers leaned closer as she explained the pattern's meaning, their faces shifting from confusion to fear. She saw in their expressions the same realization she once felt. This wasn't simply a return of old danger, it was an evolution. Whoever or whatever was behind this signal had spent years learning their weaknesses, and now it was pressing directly into the cracks they couldn't afford to ignore. The command center shifted into motion as officers hurried to stations, yet even in the rush she sensed uncertainty gripping the room. She stepped aside, watching the coordinated movements unfold with the experience of someone who once shaped them. But this time she wasn't here to command. She was here because she understood the enemy, better than anyone still in uniform. She knew the next strike would not come where the data suggested. It would come where confidence was highest, where no one expected a breach. She tapped the screen, redirecting attention to a location buried beneath assumptions of safety. The officers paused, seeing the logic unfold. The storm was forming, and if they didn't brace for the right impact point, it would crack the base open from the inside. The strategist's hesitation told her he remembered fragments of the old reports, just enough to sense the danger, but not enough to act with confidence. She stepped closer to the projection, outlining a chain reaction that once nearly sparked a crisis larger than anyone realized. Those events had been buried under layers of secrecy, hidden even from most of the personnel now serving here. But she had lived them, and she understood the subtle signs long before they fully emerged. The room grew still as she described what would happen if they ignored this shift. Communications failures, misinterpreted signals, and a breach that would spread faster than any of them could contain. The threat wasn't theoretical. It was already unfolding, step by step. She finally stepped back, letting the weight of her explanations sink into the room. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, each realizing that the responsibility now rested not just on their systems, but on decisions made in the next few hours. She could see fear forming in their eyes, but beneath it was something stronger, a growing trust in the experience she brought. She hadn't planned to return to this world, but she understood now that her absence had left gaps others couldn't fill. The threat they faced demanded someone who had seen its full shape, someone who had survived its first attempt to break free. As the team prepared for the next phase, she felt the shift she had been waiting for. They were no longer questioning her presence. They were relying on it. The room felt heavier as the team prepared to carry out the plan, each movement sharp with the tension of what lay ahead. She watched them work, recognizing the same urgency that once guided her through nights, filled with uncertainty. Yet this time the stakes pressed even harder, because the threat had already mapped its path with frightening accuracy. She could feel a quiet resolve forming inside her, the kind that rises only when the danger is too close to ignore. The past she tried to leave behind was no longer distant. It was standing at the doorstep, demanding action. As the systems powered up and the lights flickered across the monitors, she understood that the next steps would test not just their technology but their willingness to confront truths that had been buried for far too long. The warning indicators on the main screen pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, each flash signaling an approach she had hoped would never be repeated. Officers gathered around her as she explained the pattern's final stage, the moment when the breach would try to mask itself behind scrambled data. She could see their expressions tighten as they recognized how little time remained. The pattern was accelerating, its signals pressing against the base's defenses with a familiarity that chilled her. She knew what would come next, a misdirection meant to lure them into watching the wrong place. But she also knew how to anticipate the shift before it appeared. Experience had taught her that the real danger always hid in the quiet spaces, the moments most people overlooked. A ripple of confusion spread across the room as the threat signature suddenly vanished from the monitors. Some of the younger officers sighed in relief, assuming the danger had passed, but she felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't a retreat. It was the step the breach always used before striking in earnest. She moved quickly to a secondary console, pulling up a set of readings most of the team had never seen before. The familiar pulse she feared was hiding in those shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to push through. She sensed the officers watching her, unsure why the empty screen filled her with more dread than the flashing alarms. The truth was simple. Silence didn't mean safety. It meant preparation. When the hidden readings finally spiked, she felt the entire room tense, as if bracing for impact. The breach had reappeared exactly where she predicted, slipping through the blind spot that only someone familiar with its behavior would have anticipated. Officers scrambled into position as she called out the countermeasures, guiding them through steps once considered too complex for anyone outside her former team. But she saw determination in their faces, a willingness to learn and adapt faster than the threat expected. The room buzzed with rapid exchanges as the systems strained to keep up with the sudden surge. She knew this was only the first wave. The real test would come when the breach shifted again, pushing toward its final objective. As the immediate surge stabilized, the room settled into a tense quiet, each person listening for the next sign of disruption. She stepped back, recognizing the familiar pattern behind the attack. It was gathering strength, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. She knew that the next strike would decide everything, revealing whether the breach was acting alone or responding to something far more coordinated. The officers drifted closer, their earlier uncertainty replaced by reliance, born from witnessing her predictions unfold with unsettling accuracy. She could feel the weight of responsibility returning, not as a burden but as a reminder of why she had been called back. The threat wasn't finished, and neither was she. The base felt unnaturally still, as if even the air was bracing for what came next. She studied the lingering traces of the breach, noting how they twisted through the system like a shadow searching for a weak point. The pattern was changing again, growing sharper, more deliberate. She recognized the shift. It was preparing for a final push. Officers moved around her with quiet urgency, their confidence slowly rising after watching each of her predictions unfold. But she also sensed their fear. The kind that came when people realized the threat wasn't just a distant possibility, but something pressing right up against their defenses. She kept her focus steady, knowing that the moment approaching would require absolute precision. Whatever had returned after all these years wasn't finished. It was accelerating. An abrupt flicker ran through the entire command center, a brief shudder in the power grid that made the officers glance upward in alarm. She recognized it immediately. The breach was no longer probing. It was pushing. She stepped toward the primary console, tracing the path of the interference with calm precision while the team waited for instruction. The signals were moving faster now, skipping past usual checkpoints and striking at the core systems that were never meant to be touched. She had warned them this moment would come, the point where the threat would abandon subtlety and strike directly at their stability. The pulse grew stronger on the screen, a rising echo of the danger she remembered too well. They had seconds, not minutes. The room erupted into focused motion as she called out the emergency sequence, guiding the team through each step with unwavering clarity. She knew exactly how the breach would move next, because she had seen it evolve in real time years ago. The officers scrambled to follow her directions, their speed fueled by the realization that hesitation would only widen the cracks forming beneath them. She watched the signals search for openings, bouncing off barriers the team struggled to maintain. The breach was learning with every failed attempt, adapting faster than their defensive software could respond. But she also saw an opportunity, a narrow window where the threat's attention shifted just long enough for a counterstrike to slip through. She pointed to the opening, urging the team to act before it closed. The counterstrike hit at the exact second. The opening peaked, forcing the breach back into a limited channel. The screens flickered violently, then steadied, though the strain in the room only grew. They had halted the surge, but not defeated it. She knew this phase. The moment the threat regrouped, gathered every remaining fragment of strength, and launched its final assault. Officers exhaled shakily as they glanced toward her, seeking confirmation that the worst had passed. Yet she could not offer that comfort. She felt the pulse beneath the system, a familiar rhythm tightening like a drawn bowstring. What came next would decide everything. If the breach broke through now, the base's defenses would collapse in moments. Everyone felt it. The calm before the break. A sharp spike cut through the room as alarms burst to life once more, louder and more urgent than before. She turned toward the central screens, watching the breach surge with renewed force, stronger than any previous attempt. The team rushed to fortify the barriers, their movements quick but strained. She stepped forward, feeling the weight of every moment she had lived through this fight years ago. The patterns on the screen transformed into something unmistakable, the same formation that once pushed their systems to the edge of collapse. But she wasn't the person she had been back then. She had learned from every mistake, every miscalculation, every hour spent battling this rising threat. And now she understood exactly where to strike. The final confrontation had begun. The alarms rattled through the command center, vibrating along the walls as if the entire base was holding its breath. She stepped closer to the screens, watching the breach gather itself like a wave preparing to crash with full force. Officers moved with urgency, no longer questioning her decisions, only waiting for her next instruction. The pressure in the room sharpened her focus, bringing back the instincts she thought she'd left behind forever. This moment felt achingly familiar, the point where hesitation could collapse everything they were trying to protect. She studied the shifting pulses, seeing patterns the younger team hadn't yet learned to notice. The threat was trying to mask its final move behind layers of noise, but she could see where the real strike would land. The only question now was whether they could outrun it. A sudden ripple tore across the monitors, a jagged signal carving its path toward the deepest part of the system. She felt the room tighten with fear as the readings spiked beyond anything they had seen so far. Officers shouted updates across the consoles, their voices rising with urgency. She raised her hand sharply, guiding them back into precision, grounding the chaos with a calm they desperately needed. The breach had chosen its final pathway, the one most difficult to defend. But she had anticipated this, because she remembered the exact moment the threat had tried it years ago. The similarities were unmistakable. The same rise, the same pressure, the same attempt to push past everything they had built. But this time, she refused to let it slip through. The pressure in the room intensified as the breach hammered the defenses with rapid, relentless force. Every console flickered under the strain, warning lights flashing like frantic heartbeat signals. She leaned over the primary station, tracing the surge as it tried to split into multiple channels. The tactic was ruthless, designed to overwhelm them by hitting every vulnerable point at once. The younger officers froze for a moment, unsure which threat to target. She moved quickly, breaking down the attack in simple steps, guiding them through the chaos with a clarity honed from years of facing this exact storm. The noise on the screens finally sharpened into a single readable line. She saw it immediately, the opening they needed. But taking it would push the system to its limit. She issued the order to isolate the breach, her voice steady despite the tension twisting through the room. Officers executed the command with determined urgency, cutting off channel after channel until the threat had no choice but to compress into a single line. The monitors trembled as the pressure built, the flickering lights reflecting the strain running through every system. She knew what would happen next. The breach would either lash out with everything it had left, or collapse under its own force. The room felt suspended in a fragile moment, officers gripping their stations as they waited for the outcome. She held her breath, watching the pulse narrow into a thin, bright line. This was the point of no return. Either they ended it here, or it shattered through them. A final, blinding surge filled the screens as the breach struck with every remaining fragment of strength. The command center shook with the force of it, alarms screaming in unison. She called out the last override sequence, her voice cutting through the chaos with complete authority. Officers echoed the commands, their hands moving in rapid coordination. The air buzzed with energy, the system groaning under the weight of the counterforce. Then, as suddenly as it rose, the surge collapsed inward, the lights stabilizing into a steady, unbroken glow. Silence washed over the room, heavy and disbelieving. After years of dormancy, the threat had finally been contained. She exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. The danger wasn't gone forever, but they had stopped it today. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe. The command center settled into a thick quiet, the kind that only follows a battle fought on the edge of collapse. She stood still, letting the steady glow of the screens confirm what everyone needed to feel. Safety returning, even if only for now. Around her, the officers shifted between exhaustion and disbelief, realizing they had come closer than they understood to losing everything. She didn't need to explain the danger that had been avoided. The weight lingering in the air spoke for her. She knew the threat could rise again someday, but at least for this moment, the world was steady, and as she watched the team move with newfound confidence, she understood something unexpected. Her return had not just confronted the past, it had reshaped their future. She walked through the corridor that once felt overwhelming, now softened by the quiet steps of officers who followed a few paces behind. Their movements carried a different tone, respect born not from rank or protocol, but from witnessing a level of expertise they hadn't known existed. She felt the shift in every nod, every glance that met her with gratitude rather than uncertainty. The base around her seemed lighter, as though the walls themselves recognized that the shadow hanging over them had finally lifted. Still, a familiar weight rested in her chest. Oh, she had been drawn back into a world she thought she had left behind. And though victory had come, she wondered whether the price of returning might echo long after she walked out of these halls. In the debriefing room, she sat at the table surrounded by officers who now relied on her insight more than ever. Papers rustled softly as the team reviewed the final data, each chart confirming how close the breach had come to breaking through. She offered clear explanations, simplifying the pattern so they could recognize it in the future. The room filled with quiet concentration as they absorbed every word she shared. She didn't speak to frighten them. She spoke to prepare them. The responsibility she once carried alone now belonged to a team ready to guard the world she once protected. And for the first time, she felt a spark of reassurance that maybe she had returned not to reopen old wounds, but to pass on the wisdom forged within them. The sun dipped low as she stepped outside, casting long shadows across the base she once knew too well. The weight of the day settled on her shoulders, but not with the heaviness she expected. Instead, a quiet calm wrapped around her, a reminder that even the hardest battles could bring clarity. She watched as younger soldiers moved across the courtyard, unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. She didn't need recognition or ceremony. Knowing they were safe was enough. The wind carried faint echoes of her past, but for the first time in years, they no longer felt like warnings. They felt like closure. She approached the outer gate, the same one she had passed through at the start of the day, though everything about her return felt transformed. Guards who once looked past her now straightened with genuine respect, their quiet nods acknowledging what had unfolded behind these walls. She paused for a moment, letting the cool air brush against her face as the memories of the day settled into place. There was no triumph in her expression, only a steady resolve. She had stepped back into a world that needed her, and she answered without hesitation. Now, as she crossed through the gate, she carried with her a truth no one at the DMV would ever guess. Sometimes the quietest people carry the greatest battles in their past and the strength to face them again.